We're starting here, y'all. Icy water slithered down the necks of their shirts. Seaman took off the snow, shook off the snow, but his outer coat got soaked anyway. Snow clumped between the pads of his paws, and he kept stopping to chew out the painful icy balls. That night, Clark complained in his journal. I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Cold, exhausted, and hungry, the men killed a second colt for supper. The explorers had so little food that they felt hungry all the time, but they were eating enough to keep themselves alive. Their horses, on the other hand, were starving. All of the grasses were dead, so buried under the snow. On the morning of September 17th, the explorers awoke to Seaman's barking. The whole herd of those horses was missing. During the night, the animals had strayed all over the countryside in desperate search for food. The men began rounding up the animals at first light. It took hours. Seaman herded some of the strays by nipping at their heels to drive them back to camp. By the time the horses were collected and packed, much of the daylight had been wasted. Everybody was frustrated. The weather warmed up, but that only made traveling more uncomfortable. The snow melted into icy water and soaked through their moccasins. That night, the explorers had to kill a third colt for supper. That was the last colt in their herd. After that evening meal, Lewis checked the remaining supplies, then huddled with Clark, and the captains talked quietly. Seaman padded over to Lewis and sat close to him, gently nuzzling his master's hand. I fear we are reaching a breaking point, Lewis said, his tone gloomy and his eyes downcast. What is our stock? Clark asked. I counted a few canisters of dried soup mix, a bit of bear oil, and 20 pounds of candles. Hardly enough to sustain the needs of more than 30 people, Lewis replied. Clark nodded. Of course, we have our own rifles and plenty of ammunition. Lewis frowned. The guns are little use in this country where there is scarcely an animal to be found. When we hunted on the plains, the land yielded a feast. But up here, we're fortunate to find a few small grouse, some squirrels, or a couple of jays in these mountains. The land yields famine. And the men are exhausted, Clark agreed sadly. I find myself growing weak and light-hearted, for I want food. The captain sat still, each deep in his own thoughts. The only movement was Lewis's hand rhythmically stroking Seaman's fur. Small comfort, perhaps, but in the absence of any other, the touch provided some relief. The heavy thoughts that weighed down the captain's minds. Perhaps we should kill one of the pack horses as food, suggested Clark. Lewis shook his head. No, that would mean abandoning some of our baggage. We don't know how far we must travel to reach the Western Sea, William. We already left everything we could spare in our last cache. What remains is essential. Clark nodded and frowned. It's 5 days' travel back to the Bitter Root, Meriwether. I don't think we have the strength to make it, he said flatly. I'm not suggesting that we turn back, Lewis spoke in a shocked voice. His face became a stone mask of determination. Unthinkable! I would prefer to die than quit. Agreed, Clark said simply. He looked around the camp. But there are other lives to consider here, Meriwether, not to mention information, a wealth of information. Our field notes and journals, the specimens for our scientists back east. The captain's eyes met. We must divide our force, Lewis said in a grim voice. We must send smaller groups to hurry ahead to level country to hunt. The advance group will send food back to the rest for our party. Clark winced. I dislike dividing the corpse, Meriwether, especially now when our survival is at stake. They were quiet for a minute, staring at the fire. Then Clark met Lewis's eyes. But I agree, it's our best chance. They decided Clark would take 6 of the best hunters as the group advanced. Lewis would remain with the main party, which included Seaman, Old Toby, Charbanu's family, and most of the men, and all of the pack horses. Clark's group set out at dawn on September 18th. As soon as Lewis's group packed the horses, they proceeded on September 19th, Lewis's group reached a narrow path beside a steep cliff. As they carefully made their way along the ledge, the men tried to avoid looking down at the 300-foot drop beside them. All day long, the horses stumbled over the uneven ground, keeping as far as possible from the ledge of the cliff. Each time a stone loosened and fell, Lewis gritted his teeth and prayed that nobody would fall off the path. Their luck held. Although they sometimes slipped, the men and the horses were able to gain their shaky footing. At dusk, their luck took a plunge. One of the pack horses started to slide and couldn't recover in its foothold. Seaman barked to alert the men. Several of the men dismounted and edged toward the horse in trouble, but they were unable to reach the animal. They watched helplessly as the horse rolled down and down. It landed with a great splash in the creek at the bottom of a cliff. The men scrambled down the slope to save what they could. Quickly they untied the horse's load, and they watched, amazed, as the animal rose shakily to its feet. The men shuddered the horse's load and led the trembling but unhurt animal back up to its steep path. The next morning, it was a silent group that plodded behind old Toby. The hardships of the journey, the constant cramp of the hunger and the extreme physical exertion, the fear of death in these mountains were straining the explorers to the limits of their endurance. Suddenly, Seaman pushed his nose to the air and sniffed deeply. He dashed ahead of the group and then returned and pranced excitedly around the legs of Lewis's horse. Barking, Lewis hurried ahead, curious about what Seaman had discovered. There he found the most welcome sight, a big bundle of fresh meat that had been tied to an overhanging branch. Clark's advance group had killed a wild horse and left some of the meat for Lewis's party. A twig was sticking out of the bundle with a note at the end of it. Lewis leaped off his horse and grabbed the note. It told him that Clark's hunters were moving swiftly toward ground level. As soon as they were out of the mountains, they would begin hunting. Lewis shut his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." The group immediately started a fire to prepare the food. Oh, the smell of the roasting meat! The explorer's mouth watered. 2 long threads of drool dangled from Seaman's jaws. The food lifted the group's spirits even before it filled their bellies. Seaman darted around the camp, retrieving a stick, and tossed it to Shannon. York made a lightning-quick grab at the stick when Seaman ran past him and teased the dog into a tug-of-war. But the supper pot was about to boil over, so York gave up and let Seaman have the stick. Seaman played with Shannon until supper was served. He wolfed down his share, but nobody objected. The men were eating just as hungrily as Seaman. His hunger eased for the first time in days. Seaman padded over to join John Coulter. He waited patiently while Coulter finished eating. As soon as Coulter licked up the last drops of his supper, Seaman rolled over onto his back and his legs in the air. He stayed in that silly position until Coulter finally grinned and scratched his belly. Sacagawea began nursing Pomp when she finished eating. Seaman crept softly beside her and rested a paw on her lap. She smiled and stroked his soft ears with her free hand. In a quiet voice, she sang a Shoshone lullaby. The next day, they proceeded on. Dark circles rimmed their faces of every man. Sacagawea wrapped her horse's reins around her hands and gripped them tightly, afraid that she would faint and tumble to the ground. As they rode, she slipped Pomp off her back and nursed him, wondering how long her milk would hold out. That evening, York made a big pot of soup from the leftovers of the horse meat. On September 22nd, Seaman again dashed ahead in the group. Lewis heard him barking in the distance. The captain reined in his horse and listened. Was he imagining something? That sounded like a little bark Seaman gave when he greeted one of the men. Lewis squinted, trying to see through the brush. He nudged his horse ahead eagerly. In the few minutes, Lewis's face opened into a smile as wide as the western sky. One of Clark's hunters was running toward them, with Seaman prancing along beside him. The hunter carried a big pack on his back. Lewis jumped off the horse and clasped the hunter's shoulders. "Captain Clark and the advance group are in the Indian village," a man announced breathlessly. "It's only 7.5 miles ahead from here." He slipped off his pack and revealed the treasures to Lewis. "I've got plenty of dried fish and roots in here. Captain Clark wanted me to bring you food as soon as I could. I ran most of the way up the trail." Lewis patted the fellow's back and ordered a fire to be prepared. His group was weak from hunger. They would eat before they made their way to the village. As Lewis ate, they reflected on the events in the last few weeks, since leaving their camp at Traveler's Rest. The explorers had covered more than 150 grueling miles in 11 days. They had made it across the Rocky Mountains. The starving time was over. That evening, Lewis's group staggered into the Indian village. They were cold, ragged, and worn out. The horses looked like they were walking skeletons with matted fur stretched out over their bones. But the men's faces were radiant. They had crossed the western mountains and lived to tell about it. Curious Nez Perce Indians came out to greet the newcomers, the first white men these villagers have ever seen with their members of Clark's advance group. The villagers offered Lewis's group food, dried fish, and berries, as well as cakes made from the ground-up root of the camas, a local lily. Of course, the explorers gratefully accepted the food. They sat down to a second meal in a single day, its unbelievable luxury. As they feasted, Seaman jumped to his feet and began to bark. He dashed off into the darkness beyond the campfire, returning with Captain Clark smiling. Clark rushed to Lewis, who rose to his feet. The captains clasped each other's shoulders and took a long look at each other's eyes. It was such a relief to be reunited. Clark shook hands all around, slapping the men on their backs. "A job well done," he told them proudly. "Every single member of the corps made it across the mountains." When Clark got to Sacagawea, he paused. "It's good to see you," he told her warmly, like a father talking to a grown child. "I was worried about you and the baby." He held out his arms for Pomp. Sacagawea passed her 7-month-old to the captain. Clark held him gently and nuzzled him nose to nose. The baby gave a little laugh, and Clark beamed. He doesn't look any the worse for his travels. This is a robust little adventurer indeed. "I've just come for a meeting from the Nez Perce chiefs, Meriwether," Clark said, sitting down on the fire. Suddenly, he stopped and whirled around. Everybody was chewing, gulping, and biting hungrily into the dried fish, the berries, and the camas cakes. "Stop," he ordered. "Stop eating that food." The group stared in amaze. Didn't he realize how hungry they were? How little they had eaten in the past 11 days? "But William Shirley," Lewis began to protest, "how much of the Nez Perce food have you already eaten today?" Clark interrupted. "Eat sparingly of it. It gives you a stomach." Clark turned to Lewis and explained, "Believe me, Meriwether, we've learned the hard way. My men gorged themselves as soon as they reached the village. This is the only type of food the Indians have, and it doesn't seem to upset their stomachs, but we paid dearly for our appetites." Clark advised the explorers to eat as little food at this time until their pinched stomachs could accept the strange new diet. But they had been so hungry for so many days. Here was food aplenty, and it was nearly impossible to resist just one more bite. Although the men trusted Clark's advice, they couldn't turn their backs on the food when they were so hungry. In a few hours, the explorers understood Clark's warning. First, their bellies began to bloat. Then they went to sleep with upset stomachs and woke up in the night with cramps. By morning, the cramping was severe. In a few hours, the vomiting began. That was followed by diarrhea. The symptoms continued through the next day. These men had been so hungry that they couldn't stand the sight of food. For that matter, their stomach pains were so severe that they could not stand at all. Even Seaman got sick. He walked weakly to the edge of the camp and nibbled on the grass until he vomited. Then he padded back to the explorers, swaying with each step. All around him, men were lying on their bedrolls, moaning. In the end, it had taken 11 days of near starvation to cross the high mountains, and it took many of the explorers longer to recuperate from their first food west of the Rocky Mountains. All right, guys, I will see you on Chapter 11. If you're in my class or Ms. Thompson's class, write me a post on our stream in Google Classroom. I'd love to hear what you think of the book so far, or maybe a prediction that you have for the rest of the book. So I'll talk to you guys soon. Love you guys. Miss you very much. Let's go get it!